Morning. You two. We got a call about you. Brandon Mitchell stood right at the edge of the table. He didn't pull out a chair. Didn't look at a menu. Didn't ask anyone in the diner for their name. Marcus Cole looked up from his phone. Isaiah Brooks set his coffee mug down. Their plates hadn't come out yet. The counter on the other side was still pouring coffee for a new customer. The woman near the sugar caddy still had her phone propped up. Brandon Mitchell spoke again. Shorter this time. Let me see your IDs. When two customers are sitting for breakfast. Have already ordered. Aren't causing a disturbance. Aren't blocking any exits. And no reports describe a clear, illegal act. An officer who has just walked in can't go straight to their table without first asking the owner or the server. There is no step that allows a vague call to immediately become a command to check identification. Tuesday morning at the Rosie Lane Diner started like any other morning. The glass door opened and closed with each customer. The coffee machine ran in short bursts behind the counter. An older man sat at the counter. A newspaper folded in half. A woman sat 2 booths away. Her laptop open in front of her. Her phone propped up next to the sugar caddy. The corner booth by the back window was where Marcus Cole and Isaiah Brooks were sitting. Marcus Cole was 38 years old and had been with the Charlotte Police Department's Undercover Investigations Unit for 12 years. Isaiah Brooks was 34. Same unit. 9 years. Both were wearing jeans, sweatshirts, and casual shoes. No one in the diner had any reason to look at them twice. Marcus Cole sat with his back to the wall, facing the main door. Isaiah Brooks sat across from him, a coffee mug in his hand. His phone face down on the table. Between them was a small notepad and a phone open to a list of addresses. They had entered the diner about 20 minutes earlier. Coffee had been served first. The eggs and toast were still in the kitchen. The server walked by twice, each time glancing toward the kitchen and giving a small nod. The conversation at their table wasn't loud. Just a few names. A few streets. A few appointment times for the week. Marcus Cole pulled his phone a little closer. Isaiah Brooks used his hand to turn his coffee mug a half circle on the tabletop. At 9:08 a.m. Dispatch forwarded Brandon Mitchell a call from the diner on 5th Street. The report was short and vague. 2 suspicious black men, possibly casing the diner, possibly planning something with the bank nearby. There was no description of any strange objects. No report of a physical altercation. No one said they had threatened any customers in the diner. Brandon Mitchell listened, took the call, and drove over. At 9:14 a.m., the diner door opened. Brandon Mitchell walked in. Wearing his downtown patrol uniform, he didn't stop at the counter. He didn't ask the owner, Owen Parker, who had called. He didn't ask the server which table was having a problem. His eyes moved from the right window to the counter, scanning past the couple near the door, past the older man reading his paper, past the woman on her laptop, and then stopped on the last booth by the back window. Owen Parker was standing behind the counter, a cloth for wiping glasses in his hand. He saw Brandon Mitchell walk in, but didn't have a chance to speak. The server, who was carrying 2 plates of food out of the kitchen, slowed her pace by half a step. At the last booth, Marcus Cole was still looking at his phone. Isaiah Brooks had just put his mug down. The phone propped up next to the sugar caddy was still recording, its lens aimed at the aisle between the booths. Brandon Mitchell walked straight to that booth. He stood closer to the edge of the table than was necessary. His hands rested on his belt. There was no greeting, no introduction, no stepping back to observe further. Got a call about you two. Marcus Cole looked up. We're having breakfast. Isaiah Brooks placed both hands on the table. What for? Brandon Mitchell didn't look at anyone else in the diner. He stopped at the edge of their booth and looked down at the table. Brandon Mitchell looked down at the table and kept his eyes there for another moment. On the table were just 2 coffee mugs, a phone, and a folded notepad. No bank blueprints, no open bags, nothing pushed into the middle of the aisle. He remained in the same spot, the tips of his shoes close to the table leg. The server, holding the 2 plates of food, stopped next to the counter. Owen Parker set the cloth down on the stainless steel surface behind the counter. The woman with the laptop didn't lower the phone propped up next to the sugar caddy. "Let me see some ID." Now Marcus Cole pulled his phone to the edge of his hand. Isaiah Brooks kept both hands on the table. No one stood up. No one touched their chair. Brandon Mitchell tapped a finger on the edge of the table, right next to the small dish of sugar packets. The tap was short, steady, and loud enough for the next booth to look over. The older man at the counter folded his newspaper in half. The couple near the window turned their heads and then sat still. "We haven't done anything that requires us to show ID." Brandon Mitchell didn't look at Owen Parker, nor did he turn to ask who the caller was. He spoke right where he stood, his eyes fixed on the 2 sweatshirts and the 2 phones on the table. The call reported 2 suspicious black men, possibly casing the place, possibly watching the bank nearby. The statement traveled straight from the diner door to this booth. There were no steps in between. He changed how he addressed them mid-sentence, shorter and emptier than at first. It went from "you two" to "boys," as if it was second nature. "There was a report about you. I need to know who you are." Isaiah Brooks lifted his mug and then set it back down. Marcus Cole looked straight at the badge on Brandon Mitchell's chest, not at his eyes. The server still stood by the counter with 2 plates of eggs and toast in her hands. The steam from the plates wasn't rising as strongly as when they first came out of the kitchen. The phone propped next to the sugar caddy was still pointed right down the aisle between the booths. The ceiling camera near the back door was also aimed at that corner of the table. "You don't have cause for that request." Brandon Mitchell moved his left hand down to the notepad, clipped to his hip. But he didn't pull it out. His right hand stayed near his belt. He repeated the report from the call, this time leaving out words, keeping only the part about their skin color and the suspicion. No one in the diner interrupted. Owen Parker took 2 steps out from behind the counter and then stopped. The distance from him to the last booth was about 4 meters. Marcus Cole leaned forward slightly, just enough for the body cam on Brandon Mitchell's chest to pick up his voice clearly. "For the record, we do not consent to this request." Isaiah Brooks opened his wallet first. Marcus Cole followed a second later. 2 IDs were placed on the table, parallel to each other, next to the phone and the coffee mugs. Both men pulled their hands back immediately after setting them down. Brandon Mitchell snatched the 2 cards, turned, and walked straight out the door. He said nothing more. The glass door opened and then closed behind him. The only sounds in the diner were a spoon clinking softly against a mug at the counter and the hum of the air conditioner overhead. 3 minutes later, Brandon Mitchell came back. He held the 2 IDs in one hand. His steps were faster than when he'd first come in. No other car had pulled up outside. No second officer followed him in. The system hadn't returned any warrants. There were no records that would have kept him in his car any longer. Brandon Mitchell stopped in the exact same spot, then dropped the 2 IDs onto the table in the middle of the dried coffee rings left by the mugs. A corner of one card hit a metal spoon and slid to the side. "Get up, both of you. Out of the diner." The server set the 2 plates of food down on the counter instead of bringing them to the table. Owen Parker took another step forward, this time not stopping by the counter. Marcus Cole looked down at the 2 IDs that had just been dropped on the table, then back up at Brandon Mitchell. Isaiah Brooks straightened the cuff of his sweatshirt, his back still against the booth. No one touched Brandon Mitchell. No one pushed a chair back. No one picked up a phone to call anyone. "We're paying customers. We're staying." Brandon Mitchell moved his hand down near the cuff pouch on his right hip. The tips of his shoes were now touching the leg of the booth. Owen Parker spoke up from the aisle, saying this was his diner, and those two men hadn't caused any trouble inside. Brandon Mitchell turned halfway, told Owen Parker to step back and not to interfere with police business. The owner stopped at the edge of the aisle, his hands down by his sides, not turning back to the counter. The woman with the laptop lifted her phone off the salt and pepper shaker stand and held it steadier. The older man at the counter put his newspaper all the way down on the counter. Brandon Mitchell unlatched his cuffs with his thumb and raised them to his waist. Just as Brandon Mitchell raised the cuffs to his waist, Marcus Cole and Isaiah Brooks both reached inside their jackets. Neither man left the booth. Neither pushed the table. Two badges came out at almost the same time, the metal surfaces reflecting the overhead lights toward the aisle. Marcus Cole held his badge level with his chest. Isaiah Brooks held his badge right at the edge of the table, high enough for the body cam and the phones in the diner to get a clear view. Detective Marcus Cole, Charlotte, Undercover Investigations. Brandon Mitchell's hand froze in midair. The cuffs were still open in his right hand. His eyes shifted from one badge to the other, then down to the table. Isaiah Brooks placed his badge right next to his coffee mug, beside the two IDs that had been dropped there. Owen Parker stood frozen at the edge of the aisle, his hands still by his sides. The server wasn't bringing the food out anymore. The woman with the laptop held her phone higher than before. Detective Isaiah Brooks, Charlotte, Undercover Investigations. Brandon Mitchell lowered the hand holding the cuffs. The tips of his shoes backed away from the booth's leg by a small distance. No one in the diner spoke into the silence. Marcus Cole laid his phone flat on the table again. Isaiah Brooks didn't put his badge away immediately. The ceiling camera near the back door was still pointed at that corner of the table. A spoon fell softly onto a plate at the counter and then lay still. Your body cam is recording all of this. Brandon Mitchell opened his mouth, then said he didn't know who they were. Marcus Cole didn't stand up. Isaiah Brooks didn't touch him. Owen Parker looked from Brandon Mitchell to the two badges, then back at the two plates of eggs and toast sitting on the counter. The older man at the counter pushed his stool back a little to get a better look. Brandon Mitchell brought the cuffs back to his right hip, but didn't latch them right away. That's what we've been telling you. Brandon Mitchell took another step back. There was no more ordering them to leave the diner. No hand reached for the edge of the table again. He turned, walked straight to the door, opened the glass door, and stepped out into the parking lot in front of the diner. The door closed behind him. The hum of the air conditioner overhead once again became the loudest sound in the room. Marcus Cole set his badge down on the table. Isaiah Brooks pulled the two IDs out from under the dried coffee ring and straightened them out. Owen Parker went back to the counter, got a fresh napkin, and walked over to the table. He didn't touch the IDs. He just moved the salt and pepper shaker to the side so the woman's phone had a cleaner shot. The waitress brought their two plates of food out again and set them on the table. The eggs had cooled. The toast was harder than when it first came out. Marcus Cole picked up his phone and called Captain Daniel Mercer right there at the table. He reported the time, the location, the sequence of events, the demand for papers, the order to leave, the threat to the owner, and the moment the cuffs were unlatched. Isaiah Brooks took out a pen and wrote down the names of the 6 people who had their phones up. Not long after, Owen Parker brought out a copy of the security footage, placing it in a small bag on the counter. Before noon, 2 officers from Internal Affairs came into the diner, took the video, took the statements, took the names of the witnesses, and left with the footage and the case number that had been opened in the system. By that afternoon, the video from the diner had started making the rounds online. The next morning, it had over 2 million views. Within 2 days, the department issued a public statement and opened a full investigation. By the end of the week, footage from the diner, the body cam, and the security camera was circulating across major platforms. Within 2 days, Brandon Mitchell was taken off patrol. His old complaint file from HR was pulled for review. 3 prior complaints, which had been noted and closed, were reopened and looked at again alongside the new footage. 3 weeks later, his name was off the department's duty roster. The conclusion in his file stated he had violated contact protocols, used an unfounded threat of arrest, and repeated a pattern of behavior that had appeared in his old file. After that, no department in the state would take his application. 6 months later, the city settled the case. Owen Parker received a separate payment of $500,000. Marcus Cole and Isaiah Brooks received a joint payment of $900,000 and donated all of it to legal aid groups. After that, the department added a new step to review any ID check made without clear cause. Body cam footage was audited periodically, instead of just being archived. An independent civilian board was formed to review similar cases, and 3 other officers with similar complaint histories were also taken off patrol. 5 years later, Marcus Cole and Isaiah Brooks still sit in the same booth most Tuesday mornings. Owen Parker still keeps it open for them if he knows they're coming. The small sign behind the counter is still there, right next to the coffee machine, at eye level for anyone walking in. The words on the sign say that everyone is welcome here and there are no exceptions. Brandon Mitchell filed for an appeal twice, and both times the findings in his file were upheld. The incident went on to be used in training sessions as a case study on acting on assumptions instead of evidence. In my opinion, this story doesn't start when the handcuffs unlatched. It starts when a vague phone call was used as enough reason to walk right up to someone else's table. Which step in that chain do you think should have been stopped first? Share this story. Leave your comment. And subscribe to Power Misplaced Stories.